The Bluebell Railway runs 9 miles between Sheffield Park and Kingscote stations in East Sussex. It was part of the line from Lewes to East Grinstead, opened in 1882. In its heyday, it was an important local link, but in May 1955, the line was closed as part of an economy drive. For similar communities across the country, that was the end of the story, but not here. Local resident Miss Bessemer came across an Act of Parliament which stated 4 trains had to be run daily. British Railways were forced to reinstate a minimum service. But by now, traffic was light and losses heavy. As a result, after a public inquiry, the Minister for Transport was advised to authorise the line's closure. Closure finally came in March 1958, heralding the beginnings of the Bluebell preservation movement.
I was a railway official on the eastern region. I'd luckily escaped from the southern railway. The southern were very precise. You had to work for them 24 hours a day. The eastern region, a little bit more relaxed and that sort of thing. And I said, oh yes, I'll chair the meeting. And took along my treasurer of the local model railway club. We ran the local model railway club and went. His name was Roland Jingle, and he was quite enthusiastic. And I said, we must get in on the ground floor of this. Anyway, we went up to overseas, held a meeting. And after a bit of discussion, I said, we're here to form a preservation society, not a campaign to reopen the railway. And it's closed, finished. And I said, and I don't think diesel rail cars are quite the right thing to use, because I knew that on British Railways, diesel rail cars didn't really operate track circuits properly, and they were a little bit of a pain in busy areas. But I said, well, I think the best thing you better do is to create a steam railway, because steam was going out of British Railways. It would become a novelty, and therefore you would be doing a national good.
When the Bluebell Railway took delivery of its first engine in June 1960, it was big news. The efforts of the band of enthusiasts had been met with scepticism by many, but now it looked as if the idea was really going to work. The engine was a Terrier class, originally named Stepney. It was purchased from British Railways along with a couple of coaches for £750. A young Julian Pettifer reported on the event.
The Minister of Transport's inspecting officer has already visited the line and was satisfied that the amateurs knew what they were up to. There'll be a further inspection early in June when the engine and coaches will be scrutinised. Only if you meet the members of this society can you begin to foresee the love and care that will be lavished on this little old engine before the inspector arrives. If this devotion to puffers is unbalanced, it's a bias that affects the most diverse people. Bookies and bank managers, schoolboys, nursemaids, and retired admirals. Mr. John Leroy, a businessman from Tunbridge Wells, is chairman of the Bluebell Society.
You've got your engine, but what I want to know is, how did you get this stretch of line?
Well, it's quite a long story, really. The line was closed down by British Railways, and some time after it had been closed, they formed a society to preserve this part of the line. And we asked British Railways how much they wanted for it, and originally it started off at about 75,000. Well, we tried the football pools and didn't come up, so we eventually got it down to £34,000 for the piece of line from just outside Horsted Keynes to and including Sheffield Park. And the value of the £34,000 is almost wholly in the track. It's in the steel in the rails. Well, eventually, British Railways agreed to give us a lease.
How much are you paying for this lease?
£2,250.
Now, you've got to find £2,200 a year. How are you going to find that?
Well, we find it from our guarantors, and we also find it from the £half-crowns that we're going to charge for a ride down the Bluebell line.
Do you think this is going to be a paying proposition?
It won't be a commercially paying proposition, but ends will meet. We have been into it very carefully with accountants in London, and they have proved that if we have to pay for everything, we shall make ends meet.
Thanks very much for the trip. How did you start driving railway engines?
Well, I've been interested in steam engines and steam cars ever since I was a boy. I've had considerable experience in driving them. I've never been employed by a railway company, of course. It's only on an amateur, enthusiastic basis.
What sort of condition was this one in when you got it?
It's in very good condition indeed. It's been through the locomotive shops at Eastleigh, and they have turned it out in first-class order, and we're very grateful to them.
I came to Sheffield Park with the first engine that came, Stepney, and that was because I was at Eastleigh in the loco works when, in those days in the 1960s, people didn't buy engines from British Railways, so the fact that somebody bought an old engine rather than us scrapping it was a bit of a novelty. And as a result of this, the apprentices of the time took a bit of interest in it, and it was decided that we would come with it just to make sure that it was still okay and tell the people that whoever bought it what had been done to it. And I came to Sheffield Park thinking there'd be a long list of people wanting to help with locos, and whilst there weren't too many people who knew too much about locos, so, can you help us? So, been here ever since.
The Bluebell's first short season was very successful. Throughout the weekends of August, September and October, 15,000 passengers paid their 2 shillings and sixpence to ride the line. The railway paid its annual lease, and the work of maintenance and refurbishment was begun, and it was all down to volunteers.
What makes you and people like you spend so much time trying to preserve old railway engines?
Well, I think it's because we always had a terrific interest in trains, and it wasn't our profession, so we seek this outlet in order to enjoy the things we love.
Well, seeing that you've got such a passion for railway engines, why didn't you make the railways your career?
But I think early on, and when I was a youngster, it wasn't quite the career that people sometimes wanted to do. It certainly wasn't the career my father wanted for me. He wanted me to go into the Navy, so I went into the Navy. But I'd always had a longing to be in railways.
You mean that when you were young, the railways weren't quite nice?
I think that's probably correct, yes.
And don't you think that a lot of people might think that all this was just a little bit cranky?
I think some people do, but it's the people, of course, who have no interest in railways. And I think especially a lot of women, and there are very few women who can understand why men should love trains. But the plain fact is that many of them do, as can be seen by the 1,000 members we already have.
This was pioneering stuff. Steam was still an everyday sight on lines in 1960, and yet there was a passion driving the Bluebell enthusiasts. With businessman Horace May as general manager, they effectively initiated the first preserved railway in the country.
Tom Martin appeared in the 1960s, and Horace May had a very acute sense of business. He was a very sharp individual, and he saw Tom taking photographs, and instead of shooing him away, which Tom thought he might, he roped Tom in as the city man, you see, to publicise the thing, you know, and Tom went from strength to strength.
Tom, in the very early days, used to make a film once a year, and this would be presented at a society meeting, and all the drivers and firemen always went to this because in the very early days the shed master was quite a gentle driver, and the thought of some of the boys sort of going up the line a bit fast or a bit heavy was always reflected in Tom Martin's film, so everybody had to go to sort of make their excuses. Fred was there to sort of say what was going on here, so you never knew quite what Tom was filming. Yeah, one of the problems he had was continuity, because his film, which was made to look as if it all happened one afternoon, was probably arranged over 3 or 4 weekends. And of course, boys being boys, one of the things about Tom was he wanted the head code on the front of the train to be the same. And of course, us lot being us lot, they would reverse it, you see. And then poor old Tom would shout and bawl, and then halfway down the track, they'd go off the engine, go to the front of the engine, put the head code right, so that when the train arrived at Sheffield Park, it would have the correct head code up, and the signal would come out and say, I've had a phone call to say your head code's wrong. So, is it? Well, why? You know, it's perfectly right as I can see. And of course, poor old Tom, it took ages to bottom that they were changing the head codes up and down the line, you know.
When the Bluebell Railway first began, it ran only to Horsted Keynes, 5 miles upline from Sheffield Park. A new temporary station, Bluebell Halt, was built by the volunteers, as they weren't allowed to run trains into the British Railways station. Ironically, the new halt was opened by Dr. Beeching. He was otherwise busy closing dozens of branch lines at the time in an effort to modernise the system. There was no loop line to allow the engine to transfer from one end of the train to the other, so a second engine, aptly named Bluebell, was purchased, providing pulling power in each direction. A milestone in Bluebell history came in October 1961. For the first time, the railway was allowed to run its train into Horsted Keynes station. Passengers were able to conveniently connect with the BR electric service. Like other moments in the railway's history, Mr. Martin was on hand to record the proceedings. Morale was high and enthusiasts were spurred on. There was always something to do behind the scenes, like running the new buffet car. Nowadays, the Bluebell line is known around the world, but in the early days, every effort was made to spread the word and attract new members and extra visitors.
At one time there was some difficulty with Bluebell because it didn't indicate where it was. And I went to, it was my wife, we toured America and Canada to push this, do some public lectures and push over where the Bluebell was, you see, you know. And the Americans were quite thrilled about it. One American was upset because he said, it took me a day to find the Bluebell Railway. He said, when I got there, he said, they were good enough to show me the last train as it came in.
As Bernard Holden had predicted, the face of the country's railway system was changing beyond all recognition. Thousands of miles of track were cut by Dr. Beeching's axe, 2,000 stations closed, and steam was fast disappearing. It all served to strengthen the Bluebell's appeal. The preserved railway was eventually able to buy more British Railways stock, like Birch Grove, which for several years was the most powerful engine on the line. In October 1963, Tom Martin recorded the closure of the line connecting the Bluebell Railway and the British Railways network. Preservation Society members were determined to mark the occasion in style.
We had the Brighton Bluebell, which was the last train from Brighton to Horsted Keynes before the line shut. We all turned out in period costume, and they had the Lancing Bell set, and I took our own two engines to Brighton, Stepney and Birch Grove, long before mainline running was the in thing like it is today. Great fun here because the old Lancing Bell coaches were used for the workmen's trains, and they had to whitewash the interior to take all the rude words off. But we went on the Volks Electric Railway and then open top buses to Brighton Station, and then we came up to Sheffield Park via Horsted Keynes. And Tom filmed many, many members, quite a few of whom have now departed this life. And again, this brings back the memories of those days, those heady days of the 1960s, when we carried all before us, really. And it was a unique railway because there wasn't anybody else in the country until 1968.
The Bluebell Preservation Society wasn't content simply to preserve the concept of steam. Members wanted to get their hands dirty. In 1962, an ambitious project to restore a locomotive was begun. It would take over 2 years to complete. Number 9017, Earl of Berkeley, a Duke Dog class engine, was purchased privately by enthusiast Tom Gomm and brought to the line. It received a very enthusiastic welcome as it made its debut at Horsted Keynes. There was no shortage of help. A team of volunteers spent hundreds of man-hours carrying out mechanical work and cleaning, painting and polishing. Finally, bearing its original number, 3217, the Earl was back in steam. Resplendent with new livery, the former Great Western engine embarked on a new career. A new chapter in Bluebell history had begun. The same engine underwent complete restoration at the line's loco works in 2003. In the early days, rolling stock was limited to a handful of coaches. During the ensuing years, this grew in number and a specialist workshop was opened. Today, the railway boasts one of the finest collections of vintage stock anywhere, some of which is owned privately by individuals with a passion for the past. The lineup includes an impressive rake of 4 restored Pullman cars. 4 decades after these scenes were captured, the railway still relies largely on voluntary staff.
In these days of modern mass production, when everything is throwaway, you buy something, you get rid of it a few years later, these engines were built to last. Some go right back to 1872. And in those days, there was a great pride in the job and in the workmanship that they turned out. And like all volunteers, if you see a train go round the bend or round the corner, you look at the engine, you look at the coach, you think, well, there's something on that I did. And if I hadn't done that, it wouldn't be running. So you take a pride in the job, and you turn out the best you possibly can. This railway's won many awards for carriage restoration, and I like to think we do a best good job.
There's a classic story about a little boy was shown engines in a museum, and Dad said to the little boy at the end, he said, well, what do you think of that, son? And he said, yeah, well, it's super, but what are they for? Whereas here we can, you might get a cinder in your eye, but at least you can see what they're for and what they do, so it is keeping these things alive and the skills alive, and it isn't just driving and firing, but it's even sort of putting moquette onto seats and having comfortable seats as opposed to some of the things you're expected to sit on these days.
Tom Martin was a prolific filmmaker, but the full extent of his collection wasn't truly recognised until after his death in 2002.
We were very fortunate, really, because he left all these films. And my colleague, David Ainsworth, phoned me up one day and said, what should we do about this? So I said, well, we better see what they want to do. So fortunately, Doris Martin, his surviving sister, bequeathed the films to the Bluebell Railway, and I had to go to Marland to sort out his flat, which unfortunately was a complete shambles. But we did manage to secure 200 films, and my poor little car was groaning under the weight of these. And then we passed them on to the South East Film and Video Archive, where they rest today. So we saved the collection from being spread to the 4 winds.
For us, this collection is very significant because because of its size and because of its subject matter. It provides both us and the audiences and users of our material in the future with a certain depth, which usually you don't find in film collections. Because here's over a period of 40 years, one man devoting his interests in film and cinematography to one subject. I think it provides us with a very fascinating moving image record of, really, it's about the history of steam as a 40-year collection. I would estimate that maybe 10%, 15% of it has been shown to railway enthusiasts in that 40-year period. So most of it is unseen, unknown. And of course, our challenge, our wonderful challenge, is how we work carefully with the Bluebell Railway Preservation Society to think about the many different ways in which we can present this material to enthusiasts of all ages. We've already started. This year we will launch our first video program, and within it is about an hour's worth of material, which covers the late 50s and early 60s. It's colour and black and white.
These films record the very earliest days of the railway, and you have to remember in those days we were considered to be complete idiots. People used to come along, like I remember people saying to me, you're not going to last more than 6 months. You do realise this, don't you? Well, that was 43 years ago. So we've gone on from here, and this makes a complete record of all the various events up to the time when he could no longer film. And the first video we've just completed, it shows the very early days of the railway and the attitude then to this strange lot in Sussex.
Over the past 3 decades, the Bluebell Railway has continued to thrive. There's been much restoration, like the partial rebuild of Horsted Keynes Station. The carriage works have gone from strength to strength, and plans are afoot to extend the railway to East Grinstead and reopen the Ardingly branch line. Thanks to the work of Tom Martin, future generations will be able to see for themselves just how it all began and get a taste of what life was like in the past.